Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their edtech ideas into profitable businesses. Hi, Paul. Good evening. Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show. Thank you so much for taking your time out for this.
Thank you so much for having me, Jag. It's a pleasure
My
to be
pleasure.
here.
Likewise, Paul. Thank you so much. Paul, I was just going through your LinkedIn profile and a little bit of your website just to, get some information about you. And my experience most of the times is that, I've spoken to a lot of SAT test prep people, and, there's a little bit of a transition. They work for big companies first and stuff like that. At least that's what's on LinkedIn. I saw yours, you've done your education and then directly seem to have started off in 2002 July IB Masters. So did you always know that this is what you wanted to do?
Absolutely not. So there's kind of a
Okay.
joke in the test prep industry. It's not like no one grows up being like, I want to be an SAT tutor, or I want to, kids will say, I want to be an astronaut or something like that. So that was definitely not my story. I actually, so first off, I went to University of Pennsylvania, and I was undergrad. I was like, hey, what? I have to declare a major. And because I had to, declare a major, it was just time. And I wrestled in college for eligibility for wrestling and all. And anyway, so I wound up being a sociology major undergrad. And then, um, and then I wound up going to grad school for education, because what do you do with a sociology major? I don't know. One of my friends had been through the grad ed program, and he seemed to enjoy it. Shout out Zach Hunter. I don't know if he remembers talking to me, but I am still in touch actually over LinkedIn a little bit with Zach Hunter. Anyway, so and I started tutoring SAT at least in some capacity when I graduated college, and this is back in 1998. And for a little while, I worked for Sylvan Learning Center, and I think they were paying me $12 an hour, and I had 3 students at my table at once, and they were paying, I think, $45 each. It might have been $35 each, but anyway, It was somewhere between like 105 and 135 an hour sitting at my table, and I was getting $12, and I was like, hey, what's up with this? So that kind of planted the seed in my head. And then after that, I wound up, so I've been tutoring SAT for the past 25 years, at least in some capacity. I started IB Masters 21 years ago, and I've been doing it full time for 20 years. So I still teach. It's a lot more management now because I've got so many contractors working for me. But yeah.
Right. So that instance, where you taught SAT for students at $12 per hour, and then you found out, what's the difference in what they're getting paid and what they paid you. Was that kind of, were you like pleasantly surprised? Wow, teaching SAT can, it's a pretty lucrative thing.
Yes. So, and let me clarify, when I was teaching for Sylvan Learning Center, I was not teaching any SAT. I was maybe teaching a little SAT on my own at that point, and that might have been like a little bit before, a little bit after I was working for Sylvan Learning Center. And so, yeah, it was $12 an hour. I remember first teaching SAT, I taught, it was like $20 an hour was my first gig.
Right.
And then I can remember just increasing my rates, and I can remember being at like $40 an hour and being like, who's going to pay me $40 for an hour of work? Like, it seemed like it was so much. And now, I'm charging 11 times more than what I charged when I first started tutoring SAT. So now I don't really think about it anymore. I was Yeah, I'm really not thinking about it anymore. It's just if my schedule it's a simple formula. If my schedule is full, then I'll raise my rates and my schedule keeps filling.
Right. Got it, Paul. Paul, were you did you have any alternative career paths back in the day when you were doing SAT? Because if you had to teach SAT, you must have taken SAT yourself, and maybe you had some plans. Uh, and I also saw that, were you an aspiring athlete at the time?
Oh yeah, so I wrestled in college, but really, if someone does wrestle in college, usually that's where it ends. There's very few cases
Right.
of students who continue to wrestle after college. And actually, was um, I was fortunate enough to wrestle with a guy named Brandon Slay, who he won the Olympics in 2000. Um,
Wow.
so how much better than that do you get? Um, so we do have like a story. We were fraternity brothers, same recruit class. I actually remember seeing him on my recruit trip, and I was like, "Wow, this guy's neck is thicker than his head." And and yeah, so I was really fortunate to wrestle with some like amazing. We actually won Eastern Championship by the highest point total and the highest point margin in the history of the tournament, class of 1997. And my old coach Roger Reyna, who had left UPenn, is now back there, and it's just so good to see him back because university wrestling and was demanding, and so was school, and I had a job, and it was probably the most demanding, difficult type of time of my life, and but when I think back at like some of the road trips and like eating meals together and you really form a bond and it's kind of like your brothers from all that traveling together. And Coach Reina was amazing mentor, like even today. He's just an amazing influence on like so many people who he sees. Yeah.
Great. Paul, do you recollect your first student on your own?
Do I remember my like the first student I tutored?
Yeah, on your own,
So
like
when
not
I
working for another tutoring company or something.
right, right. So um I do. I don't know if I remember her name though, but I remember where she lived and yeah, I think her sister's name was Princess and I forget what her name was, but I do remember exactly where they lived. Yeah, and I remember yeah, first starting to take tutoring students on my own. And you said that you asked me a question before about were you surprised by how lucrative it
Right.
was, how it turned out to be, and were you always tutoring SAT? When I first started tutoring, I was tutoring absolutely everything. Did I tutor SAT? Yes, I did, but I also tutored classroom instruction, um, and I was working with all levels of students,
Right.
um, elementary right through high school. And I can remember like not only SAT being more lucrative, but it was also I didn't have to um I had Billy who was in 3rd grade and I wanted to staple him to his seat because he wouldn't sit still. And you don't really have to deal with that on the high school level. And it's more academically challenging. SAT is, and it's really I like it because it's the single most important test that a student will get for you take for university admissions, that or the ACT or both. And I really love uh, being a part of a student's journey. There are students who sometimes they come back to me and they say, "Hey, we would never have gotten in. We would never be where we are now had you not helped us out." And that is so rewarding. That's what makes it worth it.
Right. And you formally started IB Masters in 2002, and even before that, when you say you started teaching since 25 years at some capacity. So I believe until 2002 July, it was just part time. You were, juggling a lot of other things. And 2002, you decided to like go full time.
Yeah. So yeah, 2002. Um, so I dropped $100 in a bank account, and I made sure that my business name was not already taken. I went to the county clerk's office, and that's really what you have to do to open a business. And so I was officially in business. And I think that at that point, I might have had like 16 students. I remember that number standing out in my mind. And maybe it was, I didn't have that many students immediately. Maybe I had that many students like after a time. But I remember being like, wow, I have 16 students. And then, um, and then a year after that, I had started doing it full time. And when I was doing it full time, and this is one of the things that you're saying before as well, is I started so inexpensively that a number of things happened. Number one, my schedule was just always full, and I would just raise my rates. When I first started, I was raising my rates like $5 every 6 months when my schedule would fill. Um, and I was working. There was a time that I was working every day, Monday through Friday, until 10, sometime between 10 and midnight at night. And I was working full days Saturday and Sunday. And when I say full days, it was like, 15 at its height, maybe 15 hours a day for Saturday and or Sunday. So I when I was like just crazy, crazy busy, and I literally had like no life. It was just teach, 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 teach. But then I wound up getting girlfriends who demanded some time from me. So I wound up teaching a little less and having some sort of a social life, at least with them. Yeah.
Right, right. Great. It's been so when you right now, you've got a lot of contractors that you employ or you work with to meet the demands. But what was your first hire like, or the first person from outside to join you at Ivy Masters Learning Center? Paul?
So I can remember when I can remember first trying to get someone to work for me, and he was one of my like favorite students. We actually I did an advertisement with him, and he didn't really want to do it. His name was Zach. He didn't really want to do it, and I actually wound up tutoring his sister and his two younger brothers. They're a wonderful family. But then after, I think the first person I hired to tutor for me, his name's Joe, and um, he was just a total package. This is when I spent a lot of years being a solopreneur. It was just me. But then at some point I was like, hey, I've got all these brilliant former students. Why don't I, and my schedule's always full, why don't I hire some of them to tutor for me? And so I think the first one who really wound up working out was Joe. And he scored like 2330 or 2350 out of 2400 when it was a 2400 point SAT between March of 2005 and January 2016. So he was really bright. But not only that, and this is kind of, I've got a lot of students who are really high performers. So it wasn't just that, but it was, he's got a great personality, and he really relates to people really well. And then at that point, it's just a matter of, hey, could he convey the information well? Could he teach well? He's got the personality and he's really bright. And that's pretty much the formula that I've used. Every year I wind up taking on at least a former student to teach for me. And is those are the three things. Do they convey the information well? Do they have the right personality for it? And do they know the material well enough? And I'm so busy usually teaching myself and just managing the business that I do wind up hiring former students who have really done really well in the test. So they've not in every single case, but most of them I actually tutored myself. So they know the system and the process.
Right. So at some point, you must have, you know, decided that, okay, I'm only going to do SAT and ACT. There was a time you're doing all the things. And when was that? And when you did that, what was the typical duration for which the students spent? Did it take 20 hours or 40 hours to kind of, run through an entire SAT training with one student?
So first off, my no longer teaching classroom subjects is really there was no point that I said I'm not going to teach classroom subjects anymore.
Right,
Um, what I my price just increased, and if someone wanted me to teach them pre-calculus, I would do it. But there was a point where you could get someone for half the price that you're paying me
right,
to get them to tutor pre-calculus. So it just didn't really make sense. And sometimes I'd get a call and I'd be like, well, yeah, I could do it, but I don't have a separate price for classroom tutoring. So as a result, like now, and it's been years that I haven't had anything for classroom tutoring. My tutors do have two separate prices, one for academic tutoring classroom subjects and the other for SAT or ACT or AP or college level. And as far as how many hours I'll work with a student for SAT or ACT, um, I've always been flexible, at least whenever I could. So right now we have 12-hour packages for private tutoring. We also have 18-hour packages for private tutoring. Usually 12 hours is good for us to get the job done and do it well. Sometimes parents like more time. So 18 hours, um, sometimes parents would prefer that as well. The classroom instruction, that varies. It could be, I've run like small classes, just like 4 2-hour lessons. And then I've also run classes, 32-hour classes as well. Those have been my biggest classes. And as far as results, hey, I can remember having a student um, who I worked with him 4 1-hour lessons, and he went from a 1250 to a 1500. Fantastic.
wow,
He was thrilled. His family was thrilled. So stuff like that happens. It's super rare, but in that case, it was we knew we were going to have 4 lessons before the test, but we were going to continue to the test after that. But when he did so well just in those 4 lessons, you then they were like, "Hey, thanks. We're going to cancel all the rest of our lessons." Which, hey, that's, it's a great story. I don't mind that. Um but yeah. Anyway, so it does vary how much time I work with a
right,
student, but it's always I'm going to structure my lessons. If I'm working with students privately, then I'm going to structure my lessons accordingly. And the same thing for classes, whether it's a short or a long class. We want to hit um, the big ROI, like the big return on investment questions early on. And we're not worried as much about the details
right,
if there's not as many hours.
right, Paul. And before you take up a student, do you have a diagnostic test, where you kind of assess where they are at, and then you prescribe maybe this is the number of hours that I'll need with the student?
Yeah. So we have we have mock tests every single Saturday.
Right,
So my recommendation is always for a student to take a mock SAT and take a mock ACT. Universities don't care. They'll look at whatever test is comparably higher. So I'll give you an example. 20's the national average for ACT. In SAT, if we were to translate that to an SAT score, it would be a 1040. So if a student takes both tests, if they score 21 on ACT but 1,000 on SAT, then their ACT is comparably better. They should prepare for and move forward with that test. But if, on the other hand, they score 20 on ACT and 1,100 on SAT, then they should prepare for and move forward with the SAT. So that's one reason we do baseline tests. And typically what we'll use as what I would recommend parents use as their baseline mock test, and it could also serve as a diagnostic, is the most recent test that we have a full scale for. So, for example, the College Board, they release their tests 3 times a year, March, May, and October. And so we have the May, which is the most recent SAT that's been released by the College Board, but the scale is not complete. They never released the full scale. So at this point, we're using March as a diagnostic. And what I do is everyone receives a score report. So shout out to Pranoy for letting me use Raven, who is his admin. And she's made this great system of score reporting for us. And it helps it populates Google Sheets on, and I could see if I'm sitting in front of a classroom, I could see what percent of students got which question correct. So I know the trouble spots with the class, and we could address those during the class. But for like diagnostic, what I do is anytime I have a student, the process is the student would pay for the mock test, and then they would get a credit towards services for the same amount as a mock test. So mock tests are $45 each. Student takes 2 mock tests, a mock SAT and a mock ACT. Then they'll get a coupon code for $90 towards services with us.
Right.
And that works well because I could just look at who's paid for the tests, and I make sure that they get detailed score reports. And for that, I use one of my other colleagues. His name is Vinny Madera. He's a statistics professor. He also has a tutoring business, Test Prep Wizards, and he does the detailed score reports for us. So you'll be able to see not only the 2-digit reading versus writing and language score to see which is better within the verbal section and your 2-digit math score, but you could look at it and see, this student missed this many questions for subject verb agreement. This student missed like this many questions or this percent of questions for I don't know, in math, like systems of linear equations or something like that.
Right. Got it. And Paul, is there a score that makes you say, "Oh no, you know what? I won't be able to take up a student."
Yeah, so I had it that's tough. That's a tough question. So there's 2 things. Number 1, so if a student's in the 700s, then they've got to make such an immense improvement on their score that there are test optional universities. And if a student's grades in school are decent, then it makes sense for them to apply test optional to university. And often, like probably in most cases, when a student's in the 800s as well.
Right.
For the same reason. Now there are some of my tutors work pretty well with students who are low scorers. And have I had students who are low scorers make some like great improvements, an improvement that's submittable? Yes, I have. But that's not really to be honest with you, that's not my sweet spot. There's some of my tutors work better with that type of a student. So, and then also depending on where the student is, in a lot of cases, it makes sense for them to do something else. I think that, and maybe it's the same there, but here in US, particularly New Jersey, it's kind of like, hey, you finish high school, everyone goes to college. But there's a lot of times it's kind of like for a student who's scoring super low, it's kind of like you're trying to teach like a duck to fly. Um, and student may not even enjoy school and might have some other natural talent. Sometimes it's pressure from the parents, and it may be any number of things. But a lot of cases, students better off doing something else. Um, my brother, I have a brother who has a heating and air conditioning company. He's quite successful. Um, and so that's his path, and he's great at it, and that's what he should be doing. Like, he's not going to do something academic, but don't tell me to fix anyone's air conditioning, because that won't go very well at all. So my brothers are really handy, and I'm just not. And it's kind of funny dynamic when my wife asked me to, like, put something together or fix something. It's not really my cup of tea, but I guess I get by with what I need to get by with.
Right. And has there been a situation where the opposite has occurred, where somebody is so good that you're like, oh, you know what, this student doesn't need any tutoring?
Yes, I actually have a perfect example of that. I had tutored a a student, a student's sister. The parents called me, and the student was already her scores were like they're basically Ivy League scores. And I told them, yeah, you could just she could just like do a little study on her own. She's gonna be fine. And they still booked me. Um, and she wound up doing awesome. And she is one of those students who is just she her scores were there, her personality was there. She conveys the information really well. And actually, so I wound up hiring her as a tutor. Her name's Sahani, and she's like she's awesome. She's really great. So I actually wound up tutoring her, even though I told her parents, like, no, I don't need. Um, she'll be fine on her own. And I literally just had a report back from a parent. So this is a woman who I know from the gym, probably like 10 years ago. I met her at the gym. She knew that what I did. I tutored her older sister, or I'm sorry, her oldest daughter, and she has twins who were in my class. And now they're taking the test again, and they're looking for private tutoring. And so um, she was really wary about hiring Sahani, because Sahani is just a rising senior. She's actually the same age as she's the same age as her twins. She's the same age as these students she was going to be tutoring. And so the mom was like, yeah, that's not going to, they can't have someone that's their same age. Well, anyway, they booked an appointment with Sahani, and they loved her. She literally wrote an email. I'll read it to you. She wrote, they loved her. They said she explained everything so well, and they got so much from their session. We will be booking her from this point on. Thanks for everything. So that's like music to my ears. That's what I love to hear. And some of my colleagues actually say, "Oh yeah, I tried hiring former students who were young, like high school or early on in college, and they were just like terrible." And I can't. I feel like I can't relate to it, um, because I feel like I don't know. Maybe I just got lucky, and maybe it's New Jersey. New Jersey is um, very a lot of high achieving students in New Jersey. For example, the full title of the PSAT is PSAT/NMSQT, and the NMSQT part stands for National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. And um, so the qualifying score is by state, and the highest qualifying score in the country, top three is typically Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. So New Jersey is always among the top. And even where I live in New Jersey, there's these specialized high schools. There's a Freehold Regional School District. Each of those five schools have a like magnet program that students have to test into. And not only that, but the vocational system in Monmouth County, and actually Old Bridge, where my office is, it's in Middlesex County, but it's right on the border of Monmouth County. And we get a ton of students from Monmouth County. These specialized high schools, some of the high schools, like the average SAT score is just about an Ivy League score. So we've got lots of highly motivated students here.
Interesting. So when you have such high performing students, around the place that you live, Paul, I mean, is it mostly, your help goes into what, like helping them maybe, up their game by very tiny margins, right? It won't be too much moving of the needle, or is it any
Yeah,
other
so
way?
it depends on where they started and where they're going. And I'm realizing that I didn't answer one of your questions. But so sometimes I might get a student. I'll give you an example. I worked with a student, and he scored 1,500, and I said, "Hey, that's fantastic." So pre-COVID, the average for like the best universities, some of the best universities in the country, like a Harvard or Princeton, was like 1510, something like that.
Right.
And so I expressed this to the mom. I was like, hey, great job. His scores are where they need to be. And she said something that, I should just know. I've been doing this for so long. She was like, yeah, but not for an Asian. She's right. Like, um, there's so many um, Asian students who are so high achieving that when it comes down to it, every university has a during regular decision, there's this process called rounding the class. And this happens with majors. They might say, oh, we have too many engineers. We're going to accept the student. Now we have to reject them. We don't have enough sociology majors. We're going to reject the student. Now we're going to accept them. But it also happens with race. Universities could be like, hey, we've got so many Asians. Like, this student would get in here, but now we have too many Asians. So
Right.
we're going to wind up, that's the reality of it. It happens with gender as well. Boys go to trade school. They might become a carpenter, an electrician, or HVAC guy. Girls go to university with higher percentages. So university campuses might hang out around 51% female, 49% male, but usually the college admissions process is a little more challenging for girls. They're at a little bit of a disadvantage, early decision or early action, but more of a disadvantage, regular decision, regular action, which is why applying early is usually an advantage for students.
Got it, Paul. Paul, you obviously started off in-person teaching, right? Like face-to-face teaching. But a lot of people moved to online teaching after 2020. Did you have to, did you move online only after 2020, or, was it way earlier than that for you?
Um, it was so had I had students before 2020 who I worked with virtually, I did. So it was an option. But the classes I ran I think that they were all 100% in person before COVID hit.
Right.
I'm not positive about that. I don't quite remember, but after COVID hit, then obviously everything went virtual. So, and all the national test dates wound up being canceled. So March, Monroe High School, that's the only local high school that offered the March of 2020 SAT. All of the other SATs were canceled. All the other high schools canceled their SATs. But then May was canceled nationally. And then the April ACT was canceled nationally. I don't know if the June one was or not, but students would like keep signing up for tests and they keep being canceled. But anyway, so once COVID hit, everything was virtual, and even though the tests were canceled, I had some students who hung on to the test. And I remember, I think I had 23 private hours. I was tutoring students at that point, and it went down to 6. And I was like, oh no. Am I going to be able to afford my mortgage? Am I going to be able to, what's going to happen now? So it was kind of a scary time. But what I wound up doing is I taught everything virtual, obviously. And then at one point I said, okay, things are opening up now. I know we have to social distance, but now I'm going to make my classes in person. And then I can remember it was like literally, it was like maybe an hour before this in-person class. One of my students, the moms, had just realized it's in person, and she was like, she can't come in person. And it was probably a case where she was immunocompromised or something like that. So she said, we gotta run it. We have to attend virtually. And I was like, no, I kind of played it off. I was like, no problem. I'm going to have students in person, but you could just join virtually. I'll run it hybrid. And I remember calling one of my colleagues. He's out in Texas. I'm part of this organization called the National Test Prep Association. And one of my colleagues named Shane Bybee, he has a company in Texas, because I knew that he had run things. I think he'd run things virtually, in person, and maybe hybrid as well. And I called him to ask for advice, and he was just like, get ready to issue a refund. And I was like, what do you mean? And so I wound up teaching that class hybrid, and it went fine. And I've been teaching all my classes hybrid ever since. And it's
Wow.
really a good option. For example, yesterday I had a student who was away on vacation, but he joined SAT class virtually. Usually he's in person. If a kid's sick, but not so sick that they can't join, then they could join virtually instead of in person. It's just another option. And then I have some kids, I've had a kid from Switzerland take my class. And from Hawaii, I've worked with students from Hawaii before, California. So in lots of different places around the country, and like, at least in that one case, around the world, take like classes or work with students virtually. And I treat them exactly the same as I treat students in person. I'll call on all my students in person. I'll also call on just like I call on my students virtually. And they have hard copies of materials. If they're close enough, they'll pick them up. And if they're too far away, then we'll mail them out.
Right. But right now, you're back to in-person classes. The majority of your students are in person, and only a few of them join you virtually.
That's right.
Accurate? Right.
Yes.
And Paul, before I move on to SAT going digital and all that, I want to ask you another question. You started. It's been like 21 years, and for example, you were talking about a point where there are some locations where the average score itself is so high, and then there is a competition between groups. Say, for example, Asians have to kind of compete against themselves and not compare other scores and stuff like that. So how has the change been since 2002 to now, in considering all these little factors? A general increase in the people that take SAT or ACT, and then the increase in other races and stuff like that. So what are the changes like that you've seen, and what are the ways that you've had to adapt to all these?
Well, I think that the demographic of student that I work with has definitely changed. So I could, and there's a couple of different factors that have played in here. So, early on, so I'll say this, like, it seems like there are some countries, like, in Africa that really, like, are more invested in, education. So, a lot of the African families I work with are either, Nigerian or they're from Ghana. And, so, I mean, I had some families from, Ghana in particular early on, um, and but I really, the majority of my students I had at that point, I think were like white. And I remember people asking me, "Hey, you must have lots of Asian students." And I remember being like, "No, I really don't." And I don't know, it was because um, just the area I lived or what. And I still do. I live in the same general area. I live about 25 minutes away from where I lived before. But a couple of factors came in to play. One thing is I had a guy, his name is Victor Jiang, contact me and say, "Hey, and he said, "Hey, I teach SAT math." And this is a long time ago. This isn't, maybe it's not 20 years ago, but it's close to 20 years ago. He's like, "Hey, I teach SAT math. Um, like, do you want to pick up all the verbal stuff?" And maybe it was just because his students needed help, and he didn't like ask me for any money for him giving me students or anything like that. He was awesome. And so then I wound up tutoring, like, at one point more SAT verbal than anything, and then I don't know exactly how it happened. I think it might have been through him. I wound up tutoring this family. They owned a computer company, and then they wound up and they were involved in real estate, and they had some investors and stuff like that. They wound up buying the AT&T building in Somerset, New Jersey, I think it was. And they opened the New Jersey Chinese Community Center. And I wound up teaching classes there. And so there was a time where I had, like, the Asian students that I had were like, there were a lot of Chinese Asian students that I had. So I taught class there. I wound up working with students privately there as well. And then, like, now I'm in a situation where there's actually a big Indian population in the town. So my office is in Old Bridge, but it's kind of perfectly located because I get a lot of business in Manalapan. It's right by the border of Manalapan. And I get a lot of business from Monroe. It's right by the border of Monroe. Um, I have a lot of Indian students from Monroe. And it's kind of funny because one of my good friends, his name is Sadipta. He is I remember him and his then wife making me an honorary brown person because, like, it would be like he'd have all his friends and over for a party and stuff like that, and there would be me. I'd be the white guy. Um, and so anyway, I right now I work with a lot of I have a lot of Indian students actually. Um, yeah.
Right, right. And even from a perspective of teaching, Paul. So let's say, I don't know, I'm making a couple of assumptions here. In 2002, let's say you focused more on the concepts and the subject, and the competition may not have been much between the students themselves. But today, is it much beyond the subjects itself that you focus on? Other strategies that surround the test. Like, say for example, even if two students know exactly the same concepts and the subject matter, do they be better at time management, or the way they kind of consume the question and understand and break it down, stuff like that? Focus do you also spend time to help them out in these other areas apart from the knowledge itself, the subject
Oh
itself?
yeah, yeah. So it's not just so it's like strategy or quote unquote tips and tricks. Um tonight in the class that I taught, I just taught class between 6 and 8. Um, and in my class, I always put a problem on the board to explain a concept, to explain the importance of an approach. I put a problem on the board, and every single time, every single student gets it wrong. And it's basically, I'll do like a quick graph of it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 4, 6, 8. And then you make a line something like that. So this is, and then I'll put 4 different equations on the board and be like, hey, which equation matches this graph? And everyone gets it wrong because number one, the y-intercept is not what it appears to be. There's a 1 there. The y-intercept by definition is where x is 0. So the y-intercept is actually down here.
Right.
And then the slope, here it goes by 1, here it goes by 2. So even if so most students, I would have boxes here. And if this is the line, most students would say, oh, the slope, you rise 2 and you run 1. No, but you rise 4 because this is by 2s and you run 1. So here's a really good example of the equation of this line is actually y equals 4x minus 2. So most students will pick y equals 2x plus 2, because it looks like you got a slope of 2, rise 2, boxes, run 1. And then it also looks like your y-intercept is 2, but it's not, because that's not where x is 0. So it's actually, the equation of this line is actually y equals 4x minus 2. So the strategy here is that, tonight I had students say, I would never catch that. And I said, that's why you have to take this approach. That's a coordinate, 1, 2. Plug it into each equation. You will get it right. And you don't have to worry about the scales being different. You don't have to worry about the y-intercept not being what it appears to be. Anyway, that's just one example of approach. And it's not just content. It is approach for the toughest questions. And it might be tough because the scale is off and the y-intercept's not what it appears to be. But it also might be a question that very few students get correct because it's a parabola with a twist or something like that. So anyway, that's an example. If you have a coordinate and an equation, or if you have a graph and the answer choices are equations, and just plug a coordinate in. But then it's also, I could rattle off to you how students are typically taught in school and what you'll find on SAT and how that could literally screw them up, what they were taught in school. So I get this all the time. Hey, class, how do you use a colon? And students will be like, use a colon before a list. Well, there's literally 4 different question types that they're going to get wrong if they simply think that you use a colon before a list. Number 1, you need an independent clause before the colon. What comes before the colon has to be something that could stand alone as its own sentence. So what they'll do is they'll make the colon an option. They'll have a list after it, but there won't be an independent clause before. Students should not pick the colon there. Or
Right.
they might have an independent clause before and just one thing you would expect after. Then you do use the colon, because it doesn't have to be a list. It could just be one thing. Also, a colon could be used to separate 2 independent clauses, much like the semicolon is used, or a period. And then lastly, if you might have a list in the middle of a sentence. If that could be taken out and the beginning and end of the sentence could combine to make a complete sentence, then even if you have an independent clause before and the list after, you don't use the colon. You need matching punctuation. You need a comma before and after, a dash before and after, or parentheses before and after. So anyway, I said all that really quickly. I have this all written down, and I have my students highlight it, give them examples, give them an exercise, a drill on it, blah, 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 blah. So the grammar example was more content, but also for math, it's like picking numbers. It's using answer choices. For the reading, it's a lot of times it's having students revisit and reinforce what they learned back in even elementary and middle school. Each paragraph has a main idea, topic, sentence, specific supporting details after. Last sentence in the paragraph is concluding what was stated before. And first and last paragraphs, a lot of times they'll have their main idea. And then there's like little subtleties to SAT for reading, like approaches and things like that that are helpful as well. But yeah.
Got it, Paul. And Paul, coming to SAT going digital, I think it started off you probably finished the first digital SAT, just finished. Is that correct?
So internationally, it's been given since March of 2023, but the digital SAT is not happening until March of 2024 here in the
Oh, right.
States. Right. So we're making a clean break from it. Um, so we're just teaching the paper and pencil test until December 2nd. That's the last paper and pencil SAT. And then right after the test, like literally the students take the paper and pencil test on Saturday the 2nd, and on Sunday the 3rd, I'm going to be having students take class for the digital SAT. Yeah.
Right. As a, test prep business, what are the changes that you've had to kind of, bring in, or did you really have to bring in any changes? Does that change anything the way you teach?
Yep. So a number of things. Number one, everyone's going to be bringing a laptop to class now. Right now, I don't have
Right.
students bring laptops. Um, so I want the students to practice like they play. There's another number of things as well. And ironically, the SAT from before March of 2016 could be helpful because, for example, well, I'm just going to discuss some of the changes in the test and then we'll kind of get on
Yeah,
to
sure.
what I was about to say. So, one thing is right now we have section one is only reading, long passages, questions. Section two is only writing and language, again, long passages. So in the reading, you'll have 10 or 11 questions for each passage. Writing and language, you have 11 questions per passage. The new digital SAT, you're going to have one question per paragraph. And a paragraph might just be 2 sentences, but it's just so now the SAT could test a wider range of content, but kind of like a grammar question is a grammar question is a grammar question, but the reading comprehension, it'll be like a wider range of content. So right now the SAT is like the first pass is always literature, second's always social studies, third and fifth are science, fourth is history. But again, there's going to be like it's going to be those same concepts, but just a paragraph each, so wider range of things. What's coming back, so the SAT is also, it's just going to have 2 sections, one reading and writing section. So in just that one section, you're going to have questions, reading and writing questions all mixed up. And then the math, you're going to have open-ended and multiple choice, just like you do on the current test. But now the open-ended are going to have 5 spaces to bubble in instead of 4. But now it's also section adaptive, which means if a student does really well in section 1, reading, writing, then they're going to have a harder section 2, reading, writing. If they don't do so well, they're going to have an easier section 2, reading, writing. And the same goes for the math. So having taught SAT for so long is a bit of an advantage because we see things on this digital test like sentence completions, which we haven't seen since before March of 2016. So I still have all my materials on sentence completion. So we're going to be incorporating that into this new digital SAT. So some of the question types are going to be different. And then also the practice, all being one paragraph. What I don't love about this new digital SAT, a couple of things. Number one, anytime the test changes, you don't have as many resources, meaning not only there are not as many like supplemental books, which honestly I don't use very many supplemental books when I teach. I like to use authentic College Board material. So right now, the SAT, the book that's put out by the SAT, has 8 tests in it. And even before, and there's actually 2 tests that were in the first and second edition. Tests 2 and 4 are not in the current book. But anyway, so right there, you've got 10 tests. Besides the College Board, the people who make the SAT, they release the test every March, May, and October, as I stated. And there's also an international test that's released every year. So we have so many resources for the paper and pencil test. So right now for the digital test, there's 4 digital tests and there's 4 linear digital tests. But the problem is, one of my colleagues, Kyle, said that there's about 70% of the questions that appear in the digital tests are also in the linear digital test. So there's so much overlap that you're not even having 8 fresh tests. Not only that, but the College Board, I could swear that they said that they're only going to have like 1 new test next year. But I saw someone post a review for the digital SAT book on Amazon who said that there's going to be 4 new tests for next year. But anyway, regardless, the number of resources are limited. So, and the reading writing is different, not only because the paragraphs are shorter and we're going to have sentence completion, there's even like some poetry on it. The math is pretty much the same. Another one of my colleagues, Mike McGibbon, has a product called Math Chops, which is excellent. And he's always doing studies on trends in the tests and what percent of SAT questions are this, that, or the other thing. So if I had a student take the digital SAT, they would probably find no difference in the math questions that are on the digital SAT versus today's paper and pencil test. But when we dive deeper, what we find is that the proportions of questions are different in this new digital SAT than they were on the paper and pencil test. So, and that's thanks to, so I only know stuff because I hang out with really smart people. So like, hey, thanks to Mike McGibbon and hang out. I mean, like, I might see him, like, I interact with him online, but I'll only see him like twice a year when we've got the national NTPA conventions and stuff. But these guys, I do count them not only as colleagues but as friends, and they're just great resources in the industry.
Right, Paul. And overall, if you just have to say digital SAT, which one is easier for the students taking it? Is it the digital SAT or is it the current one that's going on?
Okay, so that's like the $1 million question that everyone's asking. And I get that question for SAT versus ACT. I also get the question for digital versus paper and pencil. And my answer is, like, it's all a wash. And this is why I say, because a 1400, and this is off my head, but I think that I remember a 1400 being the 94th percentile. So if a student scores 1400, then they're scoring better than 94% of students. Now, the SAT, the people who make the test, they try to make every test of equal difficulty, but inevitably, students wind up doing better on one test than they do on another. So if it's a test that students wind up performing really well on, then students got to get more questions correct to get that same score. If they score very poorly on it, then students got to get, they could get more questions wrong and get that same score. So, if you're at a 1400, you might get 18 wrong on one test, might be a 1400, 21 wrong on another test might be a 1400. Now, this is true for every single standardized test, SAT, ACT, every standardized test a student ever takes from elementary school. They're scaled and equated. There's a great podcast that another one of my colleagues from the NTPA, Aaron Galumsky, he's like a he's one of the major players in Prep Matters. His business is out in Washington D.C. He did a whole podcast with um, um, Amy Seeley and Mike Bergen. Mike Bergen is the president of NTPA. He's got a business charity learning in Rochester, New York, and Amy Seeley is out in Ohio, and they run that podcast. But that's another great resource just for like how is the test scored. So anyway, if between the paper and pencil tests, and there's a really good example of this. If you were to look at the scales for test, I think it's test 8 on the SAT in the current book, it has a real, in the paper and pencil book, it has a really generous scale. So I think that 4 wrong in the math is a 790 on that test. Where 4 wrong in the math on like test 7 is a 750. So that's an example of the scales being wide, really different based on the difficulty level. Now, if we were to look at SAT versus ACT, since it's all based on percentiles, then in the end it's a wash. Like, hey, do I have a lot of students report that the ACT is easier? Yeah, but what they mean by that is it's a little more straightforward. The timing's also tougher on ACT. So our tests is one test naturally better for a student than another? Maybe a third of students score about the same. A third of students might score higher on SAT. A third of students might score higher on ACT. And again, it's all based on percentiles. So could we say one test is easier than the other? No. And the same goes for digital versus paper and pencil SAT. According to College Board, students have a much better experience. It's a 2-hour test instead of a 3-hour test. You've got these shorter passages. So like it's more, they say that students are reporting it's more user-friendly, which may be the case. So maybe students, after they take the test, they'd be like, oh, that was easier. But that doesn't mean their score is going to be comparably higher. So since it's based on percentile, I think that in the end it is a wash.
Right. And Paul, coming back to your business and getting students. So, what are the ways in which you said in the beginning that it was word of mouth, but it's been almost 2 decades. No, not almost 2 decades and more. So, what have been your major methods of getting students to join your programs?
Well, so yeah, I do love the word of mouth because, um, you know, people don't ask as many questions. They're like, hey, Johnny made a huge improvement. So we want some of that. Could you give it to us? And I'm like, yeah, sign up for class or private, depending on like I use criteria for class versus private for students. And I also like matching up with tutors and stuff like that. But um like beyond that, as you grow, you do like there was a point where I was like, yeah, I do need to do some advertising now. So number one, like let's say I was first starting. One thing I had to do is I had to put the word out. People had to know that I do this. So I remember when I first started, I put like a 4-line ad in like this weekly newspaper. I think it's, yeah, weekly newspaper. Yeah. A 4-line ad in this weekly newspaper. And so that's one thing that I did. It was like $90 a month or something like that. So that's one thing I did to get students. So, to keep the business healthy, like ongoing advertising is a good idea. So put the word out, do something as far as advertising goes. And then like, again, so what did I do? And this is just based on my own experience, but I started inexpensively. Now maybe not, maybe you don't want to start too inexpensively. $20 an hour was probably a little too inexpensive. I don't think when like the 23 or 24-year-old Paul knew what his worth was. And, in some, like, I think that like to an extent, I don't know what it is now either. But, So what I did was I started so inexpensively. I can remember when I was at $40 an hour, I had a mom call me and say, and I told her I was $40 an hour, and she was like, "What's Ivy Masters? Like, why is this called Ivy Masters?" And I was like, "Well, that's the name of my business. I went to an Ivy League school and I got my master's degree there as well." And she was basically like, "Something's not right," and she hung up the phone without saying goodbye. And I was like, "What just happened?" And people equate quality with price. So if you're too inexpensive, then people are going to think that you stink. But hey, I was getting, like, I guess the low hanging fruit when I started. So I started inexpensive. And then if as your schedule fills, you just raise your prices. And um, so that's, you could definitely probably get more students. People are going to buy based on price, or going to sign up based on price. If you are inexpensive, but you could get there. You could literally every test your schedule fills, you could raise your prices. And then, so if it's for SAT, then you could raise your prices $35 a year in that case. Okay. So, and then the third thing is do an amazing job. And this is not something that is going to necessarily happen immediately. Now, one thing is you might walk into an appointment and have a student say, "Oh, I got this SAT prep before, and I learned more in your first lesson than I learned in like however many hours of SAT prep they'd done before your lesson." So stuff like that happens, fantastic. But by doing an amazing job, like really the proof is, did the student increase? How much did the student increase? And it's that's only one part of doing an amazing job. I'd say that's one of the two parts. The second part is building the relationship. So one thing is I used to go to the house. I used to see students in their home, and there's something more intimate about that. I don't do that anymore. But when you are in someone's home and the parents are right there, the kids right there might be younger siblings right there that you see, that's great for building the relationship. At some point, if you're going to grow, then it's not really practical anymore, but you could still have great relationships by having great contact with the families.
Right, great. And another question, have there been experiences, where you've thought to yourself, okay, these are the things that you do not communicate to the parents or students, like don't do's?
um yeah, so like let's say you have siblings. It's just a bad idea to say, to like compare one sibling to another, because a lot of times, and if it's a sibling who's like not as motivated or not as high achieving or high scoring, um they've probably heard about it their whole life, and they probably feel terrible about themselves for it. um So, comparing siblings is probably a bad idea. Another thing is like criticizing the test. Like literally tonight in my class, I had a student say, "Oh, I think I'll do better on the digital SAT because of XYZ." And I was like, I admonished her. I said, "You need to prepare for this test." And she's taken class in preparation for the October SAT. "You need to prepare for this test as if it's the last shot you have in your senior year. That's where you're going to get the improvement. You want to be done. You don't want to drag this out." So, any criticism of the test, and hey, are the tests perfect? They're not. Um, and GPA might be the single most important factor in college admissions, but it's still SAT or ACT or both. They are the most important tests that students are going to take for college admissions. So when you criticize a test, then students just, that's like they have an out. "Oh, the tests are bogus anyway. Like I didn't score well, but the tests are bogus anyway," or whatever.
Hmm.
So that's also a bad idea. And then um, the third thing is to talk about test optional. Now, I am after COVID hit, like just about all the universities went test optional. Today, there's probably 80% of the universities that are still test optional. Um, Now it's a difference between like I'm comfortable talking about it with parents. Like we could talk about like, you know, universities supposedly stayed test optional to increase racial diversity. But I think that that's a bunch of horse crap because it's in the university's best interest to stay test optional. One thing is like if we were to look at the most elite universities in the country, there was a New York Times article on this. The top 0.1% in income, they're twice as likely to be admitted to most elite universities. They score the highest. Like here in the US, there's like this holistic admissions policy. And everyone wants to be like, hey, this university is looking at not just how my child's doing in school, but they're looking at them like volunteering and doing all this other stuff. And that's all like well and good. Like in a perfect world, yeah, we'd look at all those things, but those measurements are not quantifiable. You can't put a
Yeah.
number on those things. And like, so those are the things that the wealthiest score the highest on because they're the ones who could volunteer in like Costa Rica, like for Habitat for Humanity or something like that. So, rich white kids wind up getting the most benefit from like holistic admissions policy and measures that you can't quantify. So that what I see the SAT and the ACT as, they're like the great equalizers. Um,
Right.
and if Stanley Kaplan, he felt like, and it's much the situation that Asian students are in these days. He had applied to medical school and was rejected. He's Jewish, and he was like, "Hey, they rejected me because I was Jewish. Like I have some of my classmates did not do as well in school, and they wound up getting into med school. What's up with that?" So that's why he was a huge advocate of the SAT because he saw that it could be, we could have a system of meritocracy rather than, and it would be like a great equalizer. And for poor students, I have another colleague in DC who does a lot of nonprofit work. His name's Nitin, and he a lot of times these tests, he's got poor students that work their butt off to increase their scores, and then they wind up getting accepted to these universities that they would never get accepted to had they not. So anyway, when universities go test optional, they get a lot more applications. So and they have the same number of seats. So then their percentage admitted goes down. So then they're going to look more competitive. And then they'll also have a higher SAT and ACT score because those who score in below the top 50th percentile, they're not going to submit their scores. So then they look more competitive again. So GPA is also less reliable than ever. If we look at 1966, 11.3% of students who self-reported their grades to universities had an A average. In 2016, so this is still 7 years ago, and it's been on the rise the whole time, it was 55.1% of self-reported scores were at A average. And also there's difference test optional versus test blind. Test blind, they're not looking at your scores, but test optional, it's not that, admissions offices know that if you don't submit scores, it's because you either didn't do well on the tests or you wouldn't have done well or you're lazy or whatever. But I remember when COVID hit, 92% more applicants were accepted to my alma mater than those who did not submit scores. So that's almost double. So that
Right.
says something. But the test optional thing is not something that I want to discuss with my students because I want, my students, I want them to do well on the test and I want it to help them to get in. A lot of times scholarship money is tied to the test as well. So, some schools, another 50 every 50 points, you get another $5,000 in merit aid. So hey, the test is great for that. So I don't want to discuss test optional with my students. I want them to be all in on the test so they can get that score that's going to help their parents retire early because now they don't have to spend so much money on college. And, you get the point there.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, probably my last question. Although you have majority of your students in person, what are some of the software tools that you really go to keep your business running?
So I've got Acuity. So Acuity has like auto follow up stuff. And this is a project that I've actually not completed. Like I've got it all structured out in my mind, but um, August SAT, which was just it was August 26th. I'm so busy because the students are available like 24/7 and I kind of make myself available as well. So I've got like some projects that I just really haven't gotten around to finishing, and that's one of them. Um, and my website's WordPress, and we use MailChimp for our newsletter. Um, that's about it, I guess, as far as technology goes.
Right. And what about for your virtual teaching?
I use Google Workspace.
Right. So
So
you
yeah,
use Google Meet.
yeah. There's a product that I use Google Meet, and there's a product that called Pencil Spaces that is really robust. It's really a great solution, um, but I think it's going to have to piggyback on Google Workspace. So I don't know if it's going to make like financial sense for me to get it. Google Workspace has everything I need. Um, Pencil Spaces, I might look into further, but I haven't really they got this deal $1 a month per tutor for the first year, which I signed up for, but I just haven't used it. There's probably like a bit of a learning curve there, and it's got to be worth it for me.
Right, Paul. And as far as the diagnostic tests for the digital SAT goes, you said that there are about 8 tests, of 2 groups, 4 each, but they're not really fresh. Only 4 are kind of like unique. So so when there's a student that's about to join your classes, you use one of those tests to diagnose them, like where they are assessed there.
Yeah. So, and again, we're running paper and pencil mock tests until December,
Right,
and then we'll have our first. So December 2nd, and then December 3rd, we will have our first digital mock SAT. So at this point, let's say a student is deciding it could be between paper and pencil or digital, or it could be between um, digital SAT and ACT. For right now, I'm directing them to the Blue Book app. The College Board has a Blue Book app where you can
right.
take 4 of those tests, like digitally, exactly how it'll be on test day. And I have a colleague in India, her name is Sonia Mathia. And so she's been having students take the digital test since March. And she says that test 4 is the is a great test. As far as like it's in line, she says that that's most in line with the results that students are getting on their actual tests.
Got it, Paul. And when it comes to practice tests, right? Once they take your classes and then before they go take the actual test, what's the average amount of practice tests that a student takes to kind of be about the 95th percentile or 94th?
To be in the 94th percentile or whatever. Well, this is one of the questions that I didn't answer before. Like, how much time does a student take? It all depends on where they're starting and where they want to be. So, hey, it's great if a student just keeps improving. Sometimes students plateau. Sometimes they have a lot of difficulty improving because they just don't have the fundamentals, the foundation down to build from. And like what comes to mind specifically is a student whose mom had called me, and she was that student who was in the 700s. And I advised against prep. I actually told her about like test optional being a thing and being a good idea. And then she proceeded to book like, I think 24 lessons with one of my tutors and then take one of my classes. Um, but yeah, so it depends if a student's starting from an average score or if they are starting, how close they are to their goal is really going to dictate the timeline on how long they are going to prepare for. It's So it's tough to say. And then there's monitoring after that. Sometimes students respond to the prep really well, and sometimes they don't respond as well to the prep. Typically, I'll assign a test each week so we can see exactly
Right.
where a student strengths and weaknesses are. What I do is I'll assign a test the first week. And so during the second lesson, if I'm working with a student privately, I'm writing down every single piece of content and strategy that that student's missed. And from there, I give the student drills on all that content and strategy. And then once we're done with all the drills over the subsequent weeks, then we'll look at the test again, the most recent test, and we'll reassess, hey, what types of questions is a student still missing? So ideally, by the time we're finished prepping, we're in a position where um, we've done all the drills we need to do, and that student's missing just the hard level questions. And and even if they're not, whatever level question they're missing, we're just working on the questions. We're getting more of a mix of the different types of questions.
Right, Paul. Paul, great. I think, I've asked all the questions that I wanted to ask you. And thank you so much for sharing and, being candid about a lot of other things. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome, Jag. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.